Bonnie and Clyde get packaged like America's ultimate outlaw love story. Real life was a lot dumber. We're talking bad disguises, petty robberies, awful driving, canned food, and decisions so stupid they practically advertise themselves to the police. So today, forget the Hollywood version. Here are 33 dumbest facts about Bonnie and Clyde that make the legend look a whole lot more ridiculous. 1. The funniest part of Bonnie and Clyde becoming nationally recognizable is that law enforcement did not start with some genius detective breakthrough. The gang basically ran its own publicity department by accident. At one hideout in Joplin, Missouri, they fled so fast they left behind a camera and undeveloped rolls of film. Once police processed the pictures, America suddenly got the now famous images of Bonnie posing with a gun and Clyde trying to look like he was auditioning for the role of Dusty Menace #1. In other words, one of the most wanted couples in the country got exposed because they were fooling around with a camera and forgot the evidence. Imagine building a criminal legend and then getting wrecked by your own photo dump. Early outlaw selfies really did more damage than the cops. 2. Clyde Barrow's second arrest was not for some dramatic bank robbery with screeching tires, flying bullets, and a trench coat full of stolen cash. No, he got caught for stealing turkeys. Actual turkeys. That means one of the most infamous criminals in American history had a chapter in his career that sounds less like gangster folklore and more like a very bad county fair incident. This was in his younger years when he was drifting from petty theft into bigger crime during the hard years of the Great Depression. But still, turkey theft is spectacularly unglamorous. It is hard to look mysterious when your criminal resume includes poultry. You can just picture the headlines: not master thief, not outlaw genius. Just a skinny Texas troublemaker getting busted over birds that probably caused more noise than the getaway itself. 3. One of the weirdest Bonnie and Clyde stories sounds less like a kidnapping and more like a deeply confusing road trip with snacks. In one reported incident, they abducted a man, drove him around, and instead of turning into monsters from a crime thriller, they were bizarrely friendly. Bonnie made him a sandwich, they joked with him, and by the end they handed him money for a bus ticket home. That is not how criminals in legend are supposed to behave. It feels like they forgot what genre they were in for an afternoon. Of course, this does not make them harmless. They were dangerous people tied to real violence. But moments like this are exactly why their story became such a mess of brutality, absurdity, and accidental comedy. Few outlaw tales include hostage hospitality and a travel stipend. Bonnie basically ran the world's least threatening kidnapping lunch service. 4. Clyde once chopped off 2 of his own toes with an axe while in prison, which sounds so insane it almost feels made up by a novelist trying too hard. But the misery of prison farm labor in Texas was real, and Clyde hated it with the fire of 1,000 suns. He wanted out of that work so badly that mutilating himself seemed like a better option. Here is where the story becomes almost painfully absurd. Just 6 days later, he was granted early parole anyway. So he permanently damaged his own body, ruined his ability to walk normally, and then got released almost immediately after. That is like setting your house on fire because you think the landlord might raise the rent, then finding out you were moving next week. Clyde limped for the rest of his life because he made a horrifying desperation play at exactly the wrong moment. 5. Bonnie Parker died wearing a wedding ring, but it was not Clyde's ring because Clyde was never her legal husband. She was still married to Roy Thornton, a man she had wed as a teenager before her life swerved into outlaw chaos. By the time Bonnie and Clyde became the most notorious criminal couple in America, Roy was in prison, and Bonnie was running around the country with Clyde, yet the marriage was never officially dissolved. So the glamorous outlaw romance that later movies loved to sell was, in legal terms, a full disaster. Bonnie was living with one criminal while still married to another, wearing the ring from husband #1 while building legend status with boyfriend #2. Even for the Great Depression, that is an aggressively messy relationship status. It is less epic love story and more paperwork nobody handled before the bullets started flying. 6. Bonnie and Clyde became such convenient villains that some bank officials allegedly used them as cover stories for their own financial crimes. In several cases, banks reported that the Barrow gang had robbed them, when evidence later suggested the real problem was embezzlement by insiders. That means Bonnie and Clyde's reputation got so big that corrupt managers could basically shrug and say, "Yep, probably those two again," and hope no one looked too closely at the books, which is honestly incredible. Imagine being such a famous menace that people start borrowing your brand identity to explain missing money. The gang did rob places, absolutely, but the myth grew larger than the facts, and myth is extremely useful to dishonest people. This is how legends become monsters in public memory. Soon, every missing dollar, every bad ledger, and every conveniently empty cash drawer starts wearing Bonnie and Clyde's face. 7. Clyde Barrow loved fast cars, talked like a car maniac, and became associated with legendary getaways. But there is one very funny problem with the myth. He was reportedly a terrible driver. Not charmingly reckless, genuinely bad. He kept wrecking stolen cars into ditches, bridges, fences, and even rivers. So while the public imagined some dust-blasting wheelman slicing through the countryside like a movie star, reality often looked more like a panicked gremlin overcorrecting on rural roads. Clyde understood that speed mattered, and he loved powerful engines, especially the Ford V8. But loving fast cars is not the same thing as driving them well. Plenty of people worship machines they absolutely should not be trusted around. His career behind the wheel sometimes felt less like a criminal masterclass and more like America's most dangerous driving lesson, taught by a half-blind outlaw with no insurance and terrible life choices. 8. That famous photo of Bonnie with a cigar helped build one of the most enduring images in American crime history. The hard-faced outlaw woman who smoked like a boss and looked ready to rob the moon. There is just one problem. Bonnie probably did not actually smoke cigars at all. The picture appears to have been a joke, taken when the gang was clowning around with a camera at a hideout. The cigar likely belonged to Clyde, and Bonnie was hamming it up for the lens because apparently even fugitives get bored and start making ridiculous pictures. But once the image got out, it stuck like glue. Newspapers loved it because it made Bonnie look tougher, nastier, and more sensational. So one goofy prop turned into a national myth. History really said, "Here is one playful snapshot," and the public replied, "Excellent. We will now build your entire personality around that cigar forever." 9. Clyde's first arrest was not the opening scene of a grand outlaw saga. He did not blow a safe, hijack a payroll, or vanish into the night with a smoking revolver and a sinister grin. He failed to return a rental car on time. That is it. One of America's most notorious criminals basically got introduced to the justice system through what sounds like the world's angriest customer service dispute. You expect the beginning of a legend to have some kind of dramatic spark. Instead, Clyde's early criminal life often looked cheap, disorganized, and embarrassingly small-scale, which actually makes his later fame even stranger. He was not born as a polished gangster mastermind. He was a petty Texas delinquent stumbling from one dumb decision into a much darker career. And honestly, starting your outlaw journey with overdue car paperwork is about as majestic as slipping on a banana peel into infamy. 10. The public later imagined Bonnie and Clyde living some glamorous outlaw existence full of smoky hideouts, crisp suits, and romantic danger. In reality, much of their life on the run was filthy, cramped, exhausting, and probably smelled like death marinated in gasoline. They often slept in stolen cars, ate cold canned food, washed in creeks when they could, and wore dirty clothes for days on end. Imagine trying to maintain a legendary criminal image while covered in road dust, sweat, insect bites, and bean residue. This was not luxury crime. This was rolling misery with a pistol under the seat. The Barrow gang spent huge stretches of time cold, hungry, paranoid, and physically miserable, which is a nice reminder that the outlaw dream mostly collapses into stink and stress once real life shows up. Hollywood gave them drama. Reality gave them canned beans and swamp-level hygiene. 11. Clyde's reputation as a deadly marksman gets a little less cinematic when you learn he was completely blind in his left eye. As a child, he suffered an illness that left him without vision on that side, meaning his already reckless criminal life came with the added difficulty of literally missing half the visual field most people rely on to stay alive. That does not mean he could not shoot at all, because he obviously handled guns and survived a long time on the run, but it does make the myth of the flawless outlaw gunman feel a lot wobblier. You start to realize that luck, chaos, panic, and sheer aggression probably played huge roles in the gang's survival. When popular culture turned Clyde into some cool-headed trigger artist, it skipped over the fact that he was a short, limping, partially blind criminal, making terrible decisions at high speed. Not exactly the polished supervillain package. 12. Bonnie Parker had a genuine obsession with fashion and movie star glamour, which is both very human and very stupid when you are one of the most hunted women in America. She reportedly risked slipping into towns just to get the latest Hollywood fashion magazines because even while dodging police across multiple states, she still cared about hairstyles, clothes, and starlet style. There is something wildly Bonnie about that. Most fugitives would prioritize food, ammunition, or maybe a quiet place to sleep. Bonnie saw all that and apparently thought, fine, but what are Joan Crawford and the rest wearing this month? It says a lot about how young she still was underneath the legend. She wanted beauty, drama, and image, even while living in mud and chaos. The dumb genius of Bonnie's personality is that she could be hiding from a statewide manhunt and still mentally remain one shopping trip away from a magazine counter. 13. Clyde could face armed officers, prison brutality, and constant life-or-death tension, yet he was reportedly terrified of the dark. Not slightly uncomfortable. Terrified enough that when the gang slept outdoors, he insisted on keeping a lantern burning. Which is a fascinating survival strategy when your main problem is being spotted by people with guns. Darkness is usually the friend of fugitives. Clyde apparently treated it like a supernatural enemy with personal beef. It is one of those details that instantly punctures the tough guy myth and reminds you that notorious criminals are still just bundles of fears, habits, and strange little neuroses. The same man who would roar down back roads in stolen cars and fire at lawmen might also be lying awake like a panicked camp counselor because the trees looked creepy at night. History loves making people into icons. Then one tiny fact shows up and reveals the icon needed a nightlight. 14. Bonnie and Clyde are remembered as bank robbers, but the truth is a lot less grand and a lot more pathetic. They rarely pulled off huge bank jobs. Much of the time, they targeted tiny gas stations, grocery stores, and small rural stores where the payoff could be embarrassingly low. In some cases, they risked shootouts, chases, and prison just to walk away with almost nothing. We are talking sums so small they barely justify the gasoline burned getting there. That is what makes the legend so crooked. The public picture became this giant outlaw machine devouring banks. But the daily reality was often a pair of desperate criminals shaking down poor places that could least afford it. There is nothing glamorous about terrorizing a little store during the Great Depression for pocket change. It was not clever. It was mean, chaotic, and frequently astonishingly low budget, like armed robbery designed by a malfunctioning cash register. 15. Bonnie once tried to disguise herself by dyeing her naturally light hair a blazing red, which sounds bold until you remember the setting was the dusty American Midwest in the early 1930s, where subtlety mattered and screaming red hair was about as discreet as setting off fireworks in a church. Instead of blending into the background, the dye job reportedly made her stand out even more. It was the kind of disguise that only works if your goal is to become the most memorable woman anyone sees all week. Bonnie loved style, drama, and image, so this tracks perfectly. She was not going to vanish into anonymity like some sensible fugitive. She was going to accidentally reinvent herself as a moving warning sign. That is part of what makes her story so fascinating. She wanted beauty and myth, even while survival demanded dullness. Clyde needed invisibility. Bonnie kept flirting with visual branding. Unsurprisingly, that was not ideal for long-term hiding. 16. Clyde Barrow loved the saxophone, which is one of those details that makes you pause and wonder whether America's most notorious outlaw couple secretly belonged in a deeply troubled jazz duo. He reportedly carried the instrument around with him and genuinely cared about it, which means somewhere in the middle of robberies, car thefts, and shootouts, this man still made space for a large musical instrument. That is incredible commitment to a hobby for someone with no fixed address and constant police problems. At one point, he had to abandon the saxophone during a hasty escape, and by all accounts, he was devastated. Imagine being in a criminal emergency and feeling genuine heartbreak over leaving behind your beloved horn. It is absurd, but it also makes Clyde more real. He was not a movie monster. He was a vain, violent, weirdly sentimental outlaw who apparently thought armed flight and saxophone logistics could coexist. 17. Bonnie had a tattoo of two interconnected hearts on her right thigh, which already sounds like the kind of detail the tabloids would chew on forever. But the truly awkward part is whose name was involved. It was not Clyde's. The tattoo referred to Bonnie and Roy, meaning Roy Thornton, the husband she was still legally tied to, even while running around the country with Clyde. So Bonnie was basically living inside a romantic disaster zone of her own creation. She had become one half of America's most infamous criminal couple while still carrying permanent body art connected to a different man. That is not mysterious noir elegance. That is emotional admin failure carved into skin. It also wrecks the simplified legend that Bonnie and Clyde were some perfectly fused tragic soulmate duo from the start. Real life was messier, younger, dumber, and far more tangled than the myth. History adores clean love stories. Bonnie brought legal complications and leftover ink. 18. Clyde's obsession with the Ford V8 was so intense that legend says he even wrote Henry Ford a fan letter praising the car for being fast enough to outrun police. Whether the exact wording was polished or not, the story captures something very real about Clyde. He was absolutely a car fanatic, and the V8 was his mechanical religion. He loved the speed, the power, and the way it gave him an edge on rough roads and long escapes. There is something hilariously pure about this. In a life full of theft, panic, and bloodshed, Clyde still had the energy of a guy ready to leave a glowing product review. Imagine being Henry Ford and hearing that one of America's most wanted men is basically complimenting your engineering from the crime scene. Fantastic acceleration. Excellent for fleeing justice. It is one of the strangest unofficial endorsements in automotive history, and somehow it fits Clyde perfectly. 19. Popular culture loves the image of Bonnie Parker blazing away with a machine gun like a one-woman apocalypse in a skirt. But the historical record is much thinner than the myth. There is surprisingly little solid proof that Bonnie actually fired a machine gun during robberies, and some historians doubt she fired guns much at all in those moments. She was often present, photographed with weapons, and deeply tied to the gang. But presence is not the same thing as being the automatic fire queen of American crime folklore. That myth grew because newspapers wanted sensation and later films wanted symmetry. A heavily armed outlaw couple sells better than the messier truth of one man driving the violence while the woman beside him became the visual symbol. Bonnie's image did enormous work for the legend, even when the evidence for her battlefield role stayed fuzzy. History sometimes turns a pose into a resume and never bothers checking the paperwork. 20. The so-called glamorous outlaw diet of Bonnie and Clyde was mostly a horror show of canned convenience food. Think Vienna sausages, sardines, crackers, whatever they could grab from lonely gas stations, and bottles of Dr. Pepper swallowed somewhere between hiding, driving, and trying not to get killed. This was not criminal luxury. It was road trip despair with ammunition. Their life on the run left little room for decent meals, warm kitchens, or anything remotely elegant, so the daily menu often came straight from dusty shelves in places where even the flies looked tired. It is one of the best reality checks in the whole story. The legend gives you sleek danger and romantic outlaw chemistry. The truth gives you greasy fingers, fish in tins, and the kind of stale snack routine that would make a modern convenience store cry. Bonnie and Clyde were not dining like gangland royalty. They were surviving on the culinary sadness of open-road panic. 21. Bonnie once wrote a personal letter to the governor of Texas asking for a pardon for Roy Thornton, her imprisoned husband, which is already strange enough before you add the key detail that she was, at that very time, roaming the country with Clyde Barrow on a violent crime spree. That is elite-level contradiction. She was legally attached to one criminal, romantically involved with another, and somehow still making official appeals to state power, as if her personal life were not already on fire and speeding across county lines. It reveals how young and emotionally tangled Bonnie really was. She had not neatly closed one chapter before diving into another with bullets attached. The letter also shows that she did not see herself purely as the villain the newspapers painted. In her mind, there were still loyalties, feelings, and unfinished obligations, which is touching in one sense and astonishingly ridiculous in another. Bonnie was writing pardon requests from inside total chaos. 22. Clyde slept with his shoes on. Not once in some emergency, but as a regular habit, because he was so paranoid about surprise raids, ambushes, and the constant possibility of needing to bolt in seconds. That detail says everything about the reality of life on the run. There was no real rest, no true safety, no cozy outlaw evenings where everyone relaxed after a job and laughed around a table. Clyde was mentally living in permanent alarm mode, ready to spring up dressed and moving before his brain even caught up. It is practical, yes, but also bleak and kind of insane. Try sleeping fully dressed every night, packed like your own emergency bag, and see how glamorous the outlaw fantasy feels by day 3. The man loved fast cars and weapons, but fear ran the whole machine. His shoes stayed on because deep down he knew the world outside was closing in. 23. Bonnie Parker was not some born savage drifting naturally toward violence from childhood. She was bright, did well in school, won spelling contests, and wrote poetry with the dramatic enthusiasm of someone who very much believed her own life deserved tragic publication. That is one of the strangest parts of her story. Before she became a national symbol of outlaw romance and danger, she was a talented young woman with serious language skills and a flair for melodrama. Later, she wrote verses about the gang's life and sent them to newspapers, essentially helping curate the myth in real time. Bonnie did not just live the story. She tried to author it. That is both smart and deeply funny. Imagine being on the run from multiple law agencies and still thinking, yes, but let me shape the narrative. She was part criminal, part aspiring poet, part self-made legend, which is a very unstable combination. 24. Before the wanted posters, the gun photos, and the flood of tabloid mythology, Bonnie Parker was a waitress in a local cafe. She served food, worked ordinary shifts, and lived a life that would have looked painfully normal from the outside. That is what makes her transformation so striking. She did not emerge from some glamorous underworld pipeline, already wearing danger like perfume. She started in the everyday world of small wages, routine customers, and endless cups of coffee. Depending on the day, she may even have served the very type of local lawman who later ended up hunting her and reading her name in headlines. The contrast is almost too neat. One moment she is taking orders. The next she is one half of the most notorious outlaw duo in the country. It is a reminder that legends do not always begin in spectacular places. Sometimes they begin in aprons, boredom, and the worst possible boyfriend selection. 25. Clyde's older brother Buck got one of the great second chances life occasionally offers and then managed to throw it directly into a ditch. He was pardoned from prison, had a real shot at staying straight, and for a brief moment it looked like maybe the Barrow family would avoid further disaster. Then, after only a short stretch of ordinary life, Buck went right back to crime and joined Clyde. It is the kind of decision that makes you want to grab history by the collar and yell, "You were already out. Why are you like this?" Buck was not dragged back by fate in some grand, tragic way. He made choices, and those choices shoved him right back into the orbit of robbery, pursuit, and death. The Barrow story is full of bad judgment, but squandering a pardon to rejoin your notorious outlaw brother is elite-level self-sabotage. 26. Clyde Barrow may not have been a strategic genius, but he did come up with one clever and very practical gun trick that sounds surprisingly modern. He reportedly taped 2 magazines together for faster reloading, a setup later nicknamed Jungle Style by soldiers and shooters. The idea was simple. When one magazine ran empty, the next one was already attached and ready, saving precious seconds. For a man constantly thinking about speed, panic, and escape, it made perfect sense. This is one of those strange moments where Clyde's improvised survival mindset brushed up against genuine tactical innovation. He was still reckless, still sloppy in plenty of other ways, but he understood that small mechanical advantages mattered when everything was chaos. It is weirdly impressive and very on brand. Clyde could not organize his life, his crimes, or his future. but hand him tape, ammunition, and anxiety, and suddenly he starts inventing practical reload hacks. 27. Bonnie and Clyde became enormous in the American imagination, but physically they were tiny. Clyde stood around 5'4", and Bonnie was about 4'11". That means one of the most feared criminal couples in the country looked less like towering agents of doom and more like two very angry people who might need help reaching the top shelf. Their size makes the legend even more surreal. Newspapers and later movies inflated them into giant presences, because fear does that. Reputation adds inches. Headlines add armor. But in real life, they were small, young, underfed fugitives held together by adrenaline, ego, and terrible decisions. This does not make them harmless. Small people can still be extremely dangerous, and they were. But there is something darkly funny about the gap between myth and body. America built a giant outlaw nightmare around a couple who together barely looked like they could scare a wardrobe. 28. Clyde had a serious weakness for chocolate, which is not the detail you expect to find attached to one of the most wanted men in America. Yet reports say he loved the stuff, and when he was killed, a half-eaten chocolate bar was found in his pocket. That image is almost absurdly human. After all the car thefts, prison rage, shootouts, and police pursuit, one of the last tiny facts attached to Clyde Barrow is basically, man still wanted a snack. It slices right through the hardened legend. Criminal mythology like symbols of steel, smoke, and menace. Reality casually slips in candy. And somehow that makes him feel even stranger. Here is this ruthless outlaw, limping through a collapsing life, still carrying chocolate like a kid who left the house in a hurry. The contrast is almost unfairly perfect. America remembers the guns. History quietly adds, also, he apparently could not stop buying sweets. 29. Bonnie's mother, Emma Parker, reportedly became so convinced her daughter was going to die violently that she bought a burial plot and even arranged a tombstone roughly a year before Bonnie was actually killed. Just sit with that for a second. A mother looked at the path her daughter was on and thought, with grim certainty, I should prepare the grave now. That is not melodrama. That is hopelessness with paperwork. It tells you how impossible the situation had become for Bonnie's family. Whatever fantasies the newspapers sold about glamorous outlaw romance, the people closest to her saw the ending coming from far away, like a train with no brakes. Emma was not expecting redemption, retirement, or some miraculous fresh start. She was expecting a body. Few facts crush the legend faster than that one. While America turned Bonnie into a dark celebrity, her mother was already shopping for the final address. 30. After Bonnie and Clyde were ambushed and riddled with bullets, the Undertaker faced a gruesome practical problem that sounds almost unreal. Their bodies had been so badly torn up that embalming fluid reportedly leaked out through the many wounds, making preparation for burial extraordinarily difficult. It is a horrifying detail, but it also destroys any lingering illusion of a clean, cinematic ending. There was no elegant final pose, no romantic stillness, no peaceful outlaw sunset. There was wreckage. That is what a real hail of bullets does. It turns human bodies into evidence of violence, and even death does not magically tidy things up. The Undertaker was not dealing with legend. He was dealing with the physical consequences of America's most famous manhunt reaching its brutal conclusion. The public liked the story. The mortuary got the reality. And reality, as usual, was messier, uglier, and a lot less interested in preserving myth. 31. The moment Bonnie and Clyde were killed, people began behaving like history had opened a souvenir shop. Locals rushed toward the bullet-riddled car almost immediately, and some reportedly tried to snip pieces from Bonnie's blood-soaked dress, while others went after Clyde's hair or even parts of his body. It was grotesque, frantic, and deeply revealing. The public was not just fascinated by the outlaw couple. It was ravenous for physical pieces of the legend, as if touching the wreckage could transfer a little fame. That is the disturbing side of celebrity crime in America. Once Bonnie and Clyde became symbols, even their corpses stopped belonging fully to themselves. They became attractions, artifacts, meat wrapped in myth. The speed of that transformation is chilling. One second they were dead. The next, people were crowding in like bargain hunters at a carnival sale. Human dignity never stood a chance against public morbid curiosity. 32. Bonnie and Clyde reportedly promised each other they would be buried side by side, the final seal on their tragic outlaw romance. But Bonnie's mother hated Clyde so much that she refused outright and had Bonnie buried elsewhere. That means even death could not force a happy ending onto this relationship. The myth wanted them united forever. Bonnie's family said absolutely not. And honestly, from a mother's point of view, you can see why. Clyde was not some poetic prince of the road. He was the man Bonnie ran away with into violence, pursuit, fear, and an early grave. So when the time came, Emma Parker made sure her daughter was physically separated from him. It is one of the harshest reality checks in the whole story. Romance is easy for strangers reading headlines decades later. Family members who lived through the wreckage tend to be less impressed. Bonnie and Clyde got legend. Clyde did not get the cemetery spot. 33. Even after Bonnie and Clyde were dead, the absurdity kept going because their famous death car did not quietly disappear into storage or solemn history. For years, the bullet-riddled Ford became a traveling attraction, displayed at carnivals and shows where ordinary people paid a few cents to stare at it and even poke fingers into the bullet holes. Nothing says American crime culture is completely normal, like turning a murder scene on wheels into family entertainment. The car stopped being a vehicle and became a relic, half historical object and half grotesque roadside toy. People wanted proof, texture, and proximity to the legend, and the death car offered all three. It was mechanical celebrity remains. The whole thing feels almost too on the nose, but that is Bonnie and Clyde in a nutshell. Even their final ride could not retire with dignity. It kept touring the country like one last deeply tasteless encore. So yes, Bonnie and Clyde became immortal. But Masterminds is being incredibly generous. They were reckless, filthy, chaotic, weirdly theatrical, and often just plain stupid. Now let's make the comments ugly in the best way. What Bonnie and Clyde myth, forgotten side character, or insane detail did this video leave out that absolutely deserved a spot here? Drop it below. Hit like, subscribe, and stick around for more history with the glamour ripped off.